So this is biology. We want to have biology, and specifically want to look at what is called locomotion, right? Now, I'm going to try and take you back to the characteristics of living organisms, right? So if you remember in your grade 10, when you just started looking at biology, you defined what biology is, where you said that biology, the word biology is made up of two words, that is bio and logy, where bio means life and logy means study. So you said that biology is the study of what living organisms and their characteristics, isn't it? Now, what are those characteristics of living organisms? Now, I'm not going to go deep into that discussions. Instead, the characteristic that I'm interested in at this particular time is the characteristic of movement. All right, movement and locomotion. Now, we need to understand the differences between movement and locomotion. Okay. Now, when we define locomotion, we say that locomotion is simply the movement of an organism from one place to another, or from one point to another. So an organism was at this point A, and then it goes to another point B, right? It goes to point B. Then we say that what has happened there is what is called locomotion, right? Now, remember here, as we are defining locomotion, we're using the word movement, right? Now, this locomotion is with the aid. It has to be with the aid of what? Of one, the skeleton, right? The skeleton. Okay. Now we need to understand what is composed, or what makes up the skeleton, and obviously the muscles as well. Okay, so it's with the help of the skeleton and the muscles, and specifically these muscles that we're talking about are what are called skeletal muscles. We're going to discuss about that later on, right? So here what we're saying is that locomotion, okay, so locomotion is the movement of an organism, an organism from one point to another with the aid or help of the skeleton. Okay, the skeleton. Right, of the skeleton. Now here, when we say movement, the difference between locomotion and movement, all right, uh, locomotion has to be with relation to one point. So like we're saying that it's from one point to another. But when we talk about movement, it may not necessarily be from one point to another. It can even be just at that same point, right? So it may not involve the entire organism. It may not involve the whole body of the organism. It may actually just involve one part of that organism. For example, my hand is like this, and then I move it like that. That is movement on its own, right? If I'm here, I go to another point, that is movement as well. All right. So when locomotion is simply falling under the umbrella of the word movement. Okay, it's more like a subset of the word movement. Okay. Now the other thing is that locomotion usually is something that is voluntary. All right, it's voluntary, or rather, it's something that is intentional. You have to, or rather, an organism has to intend to move to another point. But when you look at movement, all right, movement may be both voluntary or involuntary. Okay, for example, uh, my hand is like this, I move it this way, it's voluntary. I decided to do that. But if I touch a hot object, what we're going to find is that I'm going to move my hand without even thinking about it. That is involuntary, right? So what we're saying, that movement may be voluntary or involuntary, while locomotion is mostly voluntary, all right? Now, We've also mentioned a very important word here, which is skeleton, right? So here we're going to look at, let's talk about the skeleton. The skeleton. Now, when we talk about the skeleton, how do we define a skeleton? So a skeleton is any firm structure of an organism, right, which helps with things such as movement or locomotion, right? And there are also other functions of the skeleton that we're going to discuss. So we're saying that this is any firm structure of the body of an organism that helps with what? With locomotion. Locomotion and movement. Okay. Now, let's talk about the functions. Before we look at, or maybe before we look at the types of skeletons that we have, we're going to talk about the functions of the skeleton, right? Functions of the skeleton. So what are some of the functions of the skeleton? Okay, so number one, like we have mentioned, is for locomotion, right? Locomotion or movement. So we have to understand that without this skeleton, it will be almost impossible to move or to move from one point to another, or to move any part of the body. Then number two, the skeleton also helps with protection, right? Protection. For example, when you look at vital organs like the heart, the lungs, and so on, they are found within the rib cage, isn't it? And the rib cage is part of the skeleton. Okay, so without that skeleton, without that rib cage, you find that it will be very easy to injure those organs like the heart, the lungs, okay, and part of the esophagus, right? Part of the esophagus, part of the trachea, and also part of the descending aorta and some other blood vessels, isn't it? So it will be very easy to have those very important organs to be injured. The skull is also part of the skeleton, right? So if you don't have the skull, imagine the skull is the one that houses, rather protects the brain. So imagine if you didn't have the skull, all right? You find that any small force to the head is going to injure your brain, and your brain is very, very important. Okay, so the skeleton also helps with what? With protection. Then number three, the other function is also for what is called hemopoiesis. Now since this is biology and this is grade 12 biology, I'm not going to be using those deep medical terms. I'm going to try as much as possible to restrict myself to the biology 12, right? So we're saying that also for production. So I'm going to say production of blood cells, right? I'm going to put it that way, of blood cells. Now, of course, this is hemopoiesis anyway, or rather hematopoiesis. But that is not necessary for you at this point. So, production of blood cells. Now, remember, we have what is called the bone marrow, isn't it? We have what is called the bone marrow. So, when a child is born, okay, at a certain stage, it's the bones, it's the bone marrow that is going to take over the production of what? Of these, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the platelets, and so on, right? So without this skeleton, without these bones, you're not going to have these blood cells being what? Being produced. Okay, so that is another function of the skeleton. Other than that, also for support, right? For support. So imagine if you never had the skeleton, if you never had bones, you find that you'd be very weak. You wouldn't even be able to stand, right? So another function of the skeleton is for what? For support. All right. So those are some of the functions really of. Then also the other function is also for production, or rather, let's say for storage. Okay, for storage of microelements, rather micronutrients. Or let me just say minerals. All right. For example, things like calcium. Okay, calcium, phosphorus, and so on and so forth. So all those are stored within the what? Within the skeleton, within the bones. Okay. So without those, without the bones, storage of some of these mineral salts, minerals, it's going to be very, very hard for the body. Okay. So those are some of the functions of the skeleton. So if you're asked in your exams at grade 12, you're asked to state some of the functions of the skeleton. These are some of the few functions that you should be at least be able to remember. Okay, is that all right? Is it okay so far? Is there any problem?
It's okay.
All right, perfect. So let's talk about the types of skeletons. All right, let's talk about the types of skeletons. Now, basically, we have three types of skeletons, right? Um, Depending on the organism. Okay, so we're talking about types of skeletons. Types of skeletons. So number one, we have what is called the endoskeleton. Okay. Now the word endo here means inside, all right? It means inside. So this is a skeleton that is found inside the body of an organism, right? It's basically you can't see the skeleton from outside. You can't see it. Okay. But within the body of the organism, that's where you're going to find the what? That skeleton. For example, human beings, or even other vertebrates. Let me put it that way. Vertebrates, right? Like human beings, or other, and other animals. Okay. You have what is called what? The endoskeleton. Okay. So the skeleton is found inside the body of what? Of an organism. Okay. So I saying that skeleton found inside the body of an organism. Now, obviously, when we say found inside, it means that that skeleton is covered with flesh, it's covered with skin, and so on and so forth, right? So, an example is humans, okay? Can talk of birds, right? Can talk of, let's say, can talk of cattle, okay, all those, right? All those have what is called the endoskeleton. Then the second type of skeleton that we have is what is called, if we have endoskeleton, then if we have something and a type of skeleton that is found inside the body of an organism, then it means that we should also have a type of skeleton that is found outside the body of what? Of an organism, isn't it? So that type of a skeleton is called the exoskeleton. Okay. So the exoskeleton, we're saying that this one is found outside the body of an organism. Okay. Now, this one is mostly made up of a polysaccharide. Okay, called what? Chitin. Okay, called chitin. Others say chitin, chitin, whatever, right? So that exoskeleton, it's found outside the body of an organism. It's mostly composed of a polysaccharide called what? Chitin. Now, an example is the insects, isn't it? Okay, insects and so on. Okay, so all those are going to have what is called the exoskeleton. Then the last type of skeleton that we have is what is called the what? The hydrostatic. Okay, the hydrostatic skeleton. So there are three types. Hydrostatic. So hydrostatic skeleton. So if you look at the word, we have the word hydro there, right? So it means that there should be a water component, isn't it? There should be some water component of it. So really, how this one is, uh, we have we find that there's fluid inside the body of an organism. So let's say that is the cross section of the organism, right? So let's say that is a cross section, and then inside there, you find that that there may be those small legs and so on, but inside uh, the body of this organism there is fluid. Okay, there's fluid. Now you should understand that fluid is, I mean, this liquid rather. Okay, it's relatively compressive. I mean, incompressible, right? You cannot compress the fluid, the liquid. Okay, such as water, you cannot compress it. So what happens is that pressure is transmitted. Okay, in this case, pressure is transmitted. So once pressure is applied at one point, it's transmitted to all other parts of the organism, right? So that's what is going to aid, to aid the movement of that organism. Now, an example is things such as millipedes. Okay, millipedes. So all these millipedes, centipedes. So all these have what? Have what is called the hydrostatic what? Skeleton. Okay. We also have what are called nematodes. Now, obviously, we are going to talk about some of these in more details when we talk about classification. Okay, so basically, those are the types of skeletons that we have. Okay, so we have. Remember, we've talked about the endoskeleton. Okay, we've also talked about the exoskeleton, and then we've talked about what the what? We've talked about the hydrostatic skeleton. So those are the types of skeletons that we have. Then we also want to talk about, now since we've talked about the types of skeletons, and then we're going to talk about the human skeleton, isn't it? I think that is where we're going to base much of our concentration, the human skeleton. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the human skeleton, right? So when we talk about the human skeleton, uh, we should understand that the human skeleton is divided into two, right? It's divided into two types. Two major categories, right? So we have what is called the exoskeleton and what is called the appendicular skeleton. Okay, the exoskeleton and what? Appendicular skeleton. Now, when we say exoskeleton, what it means, we're talking about the skull together with the rib cage, okay, and as well as the spine, okay, and the spine, or rather the vertebral column. So that is the what? The exoskeleton, the skull, the vertebral column from the neck all the way down the spine, and the what? And the rib cage. So that is what is called the exoskeleton. Okay, and then we also have what is called the appendicular skeleton. So what is appendicular skeleton? when we talk about appendages, we're talking about the limbs, okay, the legs, the hands, okay, and so on. So those are the what? Those make up what is called the appendicular skeleton. So you talk about things like the pectoral girdle, okay, the pectoral girdle, the shoulder that is, okay, together with the scapula, talk about the clavicle, okay. So all those, the clavicle, the scapula, and then you go to the humerus, and then you have the ulna and the radius, on both sides, right? And then you go down the lower limbs. You have the pelvic girdle, and then you also have you have what? The femur. You have the tibia and the fibula, all the way up to the toes. Okay, so all those bones and the joints there, they are belonging to what is called the appendicular what? Skeleton. Okay, so we're talking about, we're saying that it's divided into two. Okay, so that is one, we have the axial skeleton. So we're saying that it makes up the axis of the body, right? And that's why it's called the axial skeleton. So this, we're talking about the skull, the vertebral column, and the what? The rib cage. Okay, and the rib cage. So this is what makes up the exoskeleton. Then number two, we have the appendicular skeleton. Okay, so that is the upper and lower limbs. Okay, the upper and lower limbs. So for the upper part, okay, so we have let's say the pectoral girdle, we have we also have the scapula, we have the clavicle, okay, we also have the humerus, okay, and so on. Anyway, and so on. All those, anything to do with the upper limbs, the hands, okay, the hands and so on, all those are belonging to the appendicular skeleton. Then we also have the pelvic girdle, we have the femur, okay, and so on and so forth. Okay, so all those are also belonging to what is called the appendicular what? Skeleton. Okay, is it okay? Is everything fine? Do you have any questions?
Okay.
All right, perfect. Okay, so now, what really makes up the skeleton? Okay, what makes up the skeleton? So since we've talked about the parts of the skeleton, or rather the different regions of the skeleton, so let's talk about the major parts. So when you talk about the skeleton, all right, when you talk about the skeleton, you're talking about one, you're going to talk about the bones, right? And then two, you're going to talk about the joints, and three, we're going to talk about the muscles. Okay, so these are the three important parts or other aspects that we're going to talk about even as we talk about this topic of locomotion. Okay, so these are the most important parts, especially when we talk about the joints, very, very important. Okay, so I'm going to, instead of talking about the bones, okay, so all these, literally, we're going to talk about some of these, except the muscles. We may talk about the muscles on their own, but when we talk about the bones, we're going to be talking about them as we discuss different aspects of the topic. For example, we're going to talk about the joints, and then under joints, that's we're going to also talk about the bones and everything. So in the case of biology 12, it's not so necessary to talk about the anatomy or rather the structure of the bone, the inside, how the bone looks like and everything. It's not so important. Okay. So I'm going to go straight to the joints, and then all we need to do is to mention some of the bones, okay, some of the bones and how you can identify some of these bones and so on. That's it. That is what is important in this case. Okay. So I repeatedly talk about my limitations when I'm teaching, because I also teach A levels. I also teach I do some medical videos. So if I don't make that distinction, someone can get confused or something, right? So imagine you want to watch a medical video and then you find me teaching biology. You're going to find it quite shallow. You'll think we didn't go quite deep in the topic. So this one is specifically for grade 12 biology. Okay, so let's talk about the joints. Now, when we talk about the joints, we need to define what a joint is, right? We need to define what a joint is, and then we're going to talk about some of the types of joints. Now, for purposes of this lesson, we're probably just going to classify them, and then we're going to go deeper into the joints in another lesson, or rather in another video. So, when we talk about the joints, we have to define this is this is a point where two or more bonds, all right, two or more bonds meet or articulate, okay, or articulate. So this is simply where two or more bonds do what? Meet or do what? Articulate, okay. So if there's this bond, right, there's this bond and then there's also this bond and then they meet here, such that they are allowing some level of movement there at that point, right? There's some level of movement there, whether it is slight movement or whatever movement is there, then it means that that point is called a joint, okay? Because that's where two bonds are meeting. It could also be three joints that are meeting there. It could be four joints, four bonds that are meeting, okay? Whatever number of bonds. So as long as bonds are meeting, then that point is called a joint, okay? Now, what are the types of joints? All right, types of joints that we have. So number one, we have what are called movable joints, right? Movable joints. So movable joints, this is where mostly in our case, in this case, we're going to talk about what are called synovial joints, right? Synovial joints. So these joints, they are easily movable. They easily move about, all right? They cause movement without any restrictions, without much restriction. Then number two, we also have what are called slightly movable joints, okay? Slightly movable joints. Now here, the best example that we can give to these slightly movable joints is what are called the intervertebral joints. All right, intervertebral joints. So remember, when you look at the spine, okay, when you look at the spine, it's made up of small bones, right, which are called the vertebrae. We're going to talk about that under exoskeleton later on. So there are those small joints, those small bones called the vertebra, all right? And then in between, there is what is called the intervertebral disc, okay, which is a cartilage. Now, these are also called cartilaginous joints, by the way, okay? Also called what? cartilaginous joints. Okay, so that's what they are called. And then an example of that is the intervertebral disc. An example here, we're going to talk about the elbow, okay, the elbow, the shoulder, all right, and so on. We're going to talk about those. Then, so we have movable joints, and then we also have slightly movable joints, which are also called, for purposes of this lesson, they're also called cartilaginous joints. And then lastly, we have what are called immovable. All right. So you can see how we are moving from movable, slightly movable. So the movable ones, they easily move. Okay, you can easily move them. There is so much motion, right? And then you have the slightly movable ones. Those ones they don't allow so much motion. There's some motion, there's some movement, but not so much, not too much of it, right? And then we have the immovable ones. So the immovable ones, there is very little motion that is there. Okay, so the immovable joints, an example is what are called the sutures, right? The sutures. Now, when you look at the sutures, we're talking about sutures of the skull. Sutures of what? Of the skull. When you look at the skull, okay, when you look at the skull, it's not made up of one bone, one complete bone. No, it's made up of different bones. There's a bone here, there's a bone here, there's a bone here, and then they are meeting together to form. They form some sort of zigzag kind of arrangement like that. Okay, and those are what are called the sutures. They look as if it's some sort of a suture, like you are sewing something. Okay, so they meet like that, and then they do not allow movement there. There's very little movement, unless maybe in younger children, isn't it? In younger children, before those sutures really meet together, there is some slight movement there. But in adults, these immovable joints, or rather these sutures, they really don't allow much movement. There's very little movement that is there. Okay, so those are the types of joints. Those are the types of joints that we are going to discuss in another video, rather in another lesson. Okay, so just a recap of what we've looked at. We're looking at locomotion, so we've defined what locomotion is. We're saying that it's the movement of an organism from one point to another, and then from there we differentiated between movement and locomotion. Then other than that, we also looked at, we said that this locomotion has to be with the aid of a skeleton. Now that skeleton, we talked about the types of skeletons. We have what is called the endoskeleton, which is found in human beings. It's found inside the body of an organism. Then we also have what is called the exoskeleton, such as in insects. It's found outside the body of an organism, and it is largely made up of a polysaccharide called chitin. And then we also have what is called the hydrostatic skeleton, which is made up of water, or rather fluid. Okay. Then from there we talked about, we started talking about the human skeleton, which we said that it is made up of two parts. That is the exoskeleton from the skull, the rib cage, and together with the what? The vertebral column. All right, or rather the spine. So that is the exoskeleton. Then the appendicular skeleton, the girdles, that is the pelvic girdle, and the what? The pectoral girdles. Then we also have the upper limbs and the lower limbs. So that is the what? The human skeleton basically. And then from there we said that this skeleton, a skeleton is made up of the bones, the joints, and the muscles that allow that movement, that cause that movement when they contract or relax. Now we said that we're going to discuss bones under joints, because as we talk about joints, we're saying that a joint is a point where two or more bones are meeting and articulating, isn't it? So as we talk about the joints, we're also going to be talking about some of the important bones in the purposes of biology grade 12. Okay, so now from there we talked about the types of joints. We said that there are three types of joints, that is the movable joints, and the slightly movable joints, and the immovable joints. The movable joints are likely what are called the synovial joints. Okay, the synovial joints, and then the slightly movable joints, which are also called the cartilaginous joints. Here, an example is the what? The intervertebral disc. There are other examples though. Then we also have the immovable joints, where we look at, let's say, like the sutures of the scalp. So basically, this is what we're going to look at today, and then later on we're going to look at especially the synovial joints. All right. So in the next video, in the next lesson, we're going to look at the synovial joints. Right. Is that all right? So I'm going to end the video here.